May 12, 1945, Camp Butner, North Carolina. The air tasted of diesel, damp earth, and the coarse sweetness of pine smoke from a distant cook fire. A gray April sky still lingered in the trees like a tired flag. Sunlight broke in thin fingers over rows of canvas tents and low brick buildings that had once been a training base and now held the fractured remains of an enemy army. Boots clicked on gravel. Dogs barked. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a freight train sighed and moved on, indifferent. Inside Building 12, a red brick hall that smelled of oil, metal filings, and the faint, ghostly perfume of machine-cut wood, men bent over benches under the hum of a single, humming fluorescent strip. The benches were strewn with tools, flat files with worn handles, calipers with brass jaws, bench vices stained black with oil, and coils of spring steel shining like cold promises. At one bench, under a smudged window that framed a barbed silhouette of the perimeter fence, sat a man in a dark gray uniform, whose name and rank felt too small for what his hands could do. Oberleutnant Erich Vogel, engineer. He had been 37 the year the war began. The war that followed had made his face a map of small fissures, a thin scar at the jaw, eyes that had learned to measure people in millimeters and seconds, and hands that had become mercilessly precise. Vogel's kit was simple. A battered set of German machinist tools, a pocket micrometer, a steel rule with both metric and imperial markings forced into pragmatic coexistence, and a folding sketchbook whose corners were seeped with graphite smudges, lay beside a pile of reclaimed American brass fittings. When the camp authorities had first opened the workshop to the German prisoners, they had not known what would happen when you gave a man with a mind like a clock access to a lathe and a vise. They only knew it was safer than keeping idle hands. They were right in the way a man with a closed fist is right. The workshop had been set up as part of a pragmatic policy: occupy skilled men with work, repair military vehicles, and keep morale and trouble manageable. For Vogel, it became something else entirely. He began by repairing carburetors for the American trucks that brought supplies to the camp. He balanced flywheels and reamed bushings, turned threads to match parts that should not have fit. He listened to the rhythm of bearings and learned to hear the difference between a bearing about to fail and a bearing that would outlast a peacetime life. Outside, the change in the world smelled like gunpowder and burnt paper, and the muffled jubilation of a continent realizing it would not have to die for another winter. Inside, Vogel worked in a quieter reckoning. He had been trained in Stuttgart and Dresden before the dark years. His notebook still contained careful diagrams from a life before uniforms had a single stripe of meaning. He had designed agricultural machines in the years before mobilization, drafting sketches of seed drills that would leave neat rows in spring soil. That training had given him a vocabulary, tolerances, torque, differential gear ratios. And when the war demanded new uses for his hands, he had learned to bend that language to new ends. At the bench next to him, a corporal named James Jimmy Evans, a lanky mechanic assigned by the U.S. Army as workshop supervisor, watched Vogel work with a mixture of professional curiosity and a soldier's distrust. Jimmy had a grease-stained cap, a wartime ration of cigarettes habitually clenched at the corner of his mouth, and a habit of counting screwdriver turns in his head. He had read the orders. Skilled prisoners would be housed separately, given tasks commensurate with their abilities, and would be paid in cigarettes and cans of sweetened condensed milk. What the orders had not said was that some prisoners would arrive with the strange and unsettling power to fashion beauty from necessity. Vogel set to work on an odd commission. A broken clock wound down to silence. The Americans in the camp had salvaged it from an officer's quarters and hoped to keep time the way civilization insisted upon doing. He disassembled its mainspring, measured the temper of the steel, with fingers that felt the grain like a reader of Braille, and then, in a small private act that would become habit, sketched an idea in the margin of the clock's face. A scaled-down cam mechanism, a sturdy but simple wind-up governor that could be built from scrap and kept in children's hands without danger. He was not the only German with a past behind him. Around the room, men with titles and trades Kapellmeisters who once conducted orchestras now tapped out rhythms on a lathe. Cabinet makers whose hands remembered dovetail joints sat at benches sanding the edges of wooden crates until they shone repurposed education for the present. They laughed in low, ironic bursts at jokes told across a language canyon. They argued about whether a Whitworth thread could be coaxed into an SAE hole. They traded technical idioms with the sort of stubborn civility that arises when survival depends on sharing skill. The Americans watched, measured, and cataloged. They tested the men's knowledge before letting them near anything that could be dangerous. But danger has many faces. One of them is boredom. Another is the aimless cleverness of men left with nothing to do. The workshop policy had a moral subtext as well. Useful work made men less likely to succumb to despair or to foment restlessness among the guarded ranks. On the day Vogel first fastened a small, hand-shaped winder to a child's toy car, a cylinder of turned wood with metal axles cannibalized from a bed frame, a small knot of camp children gathered outside the wire fence. They were the children of American guards and civilian staff, bright-faced and curious, their voices high and musical against the metallic world. They pressed their palms to the chain link and watched the German engineer with a language less sharp than the one spoken by adults. When Vogel wound the toy and let it go, it trundled forward on its little wheels, wobbling, then straightening, then moving with a steady, reliable determination. A cheer, surprised and pure, rose from the cluster of watchers. It was the first time Vogel had seen his work make children laugh in years. The sound caught at something in his chest, the way the smell of sawdust might catch at a man who had remembered harvests and not only grenades. He had been, after all, an engineer of peacetime machines before the war taught him to design instruments of killing. The lathe and the vise had been tools for sewing and building. In the last 5 years they had become instruments of necessity. The toy car, humble, clumsy, joyful, reframed everything. Corporal Evans noticed it too. He had seen men break in the workshop, seen them build contraptions to pass the time or to impress one another. He had also seen men show a softness toward children that startled him. There was an unspoken trade taking place. Skill for goodwill, a measure of trust returned for a small, practical mercy. Evans cleared his throat and, in a voice that had rehearsed authority for years, asked Vogel about the mechanism. Vogel explained in halting English and more fluent hands, drawing the cam and governor, and then translated the idea into sketches that looked more like diagrams than art. That afternoon, the camp register recorded a small, unofficial project, the building of toys. It was not in any manual. It was not in any regulation. It was an idea that arose from the scratch of pencil on paper, from a man who remembered children, and from a guard who would later sign off on the allocation of spare clock springs. This was the moment the world pivoted a little. The war had ended on paper, but peace, for people like Erich Vogel, would be an extended negotiation between past and future, between a skill learned in different hands and a new life that might, if he survived the bureaucratic sifting that came with repatriation decisions, begin in a foreign country. For that afternoon, under the hum of a single fluorescent light and the chatter of men whose lives had been rearranged by 6 years of catastrophe, a captured German engineer leaned over a workbench and wound a small toy car. The toy moved. The children laughed. The future, impossible and fragile, looked like a spring being wound, waiting for the right moment to release. The following morning broke with the low hum of generators and the rhythmic creak of guard boots along the perimeter walk. In the POW compound, men stirred from their bunks at the call of the whistle, a single long note that meant breakfast, roll call, then work. But in Building 12, the air was already alive. Vogel had returned early. The previous day's laughter, the sound of those American children beyond the wire, lingered in him like an unfinished melody. He'd dreamed of small mechanisms and thin metal arms that turned motion into wonder. For the first time since his capture near the Saar, he had woken with an idea that was not born of fear. He set down his enamel mug of weak coffee and began sketching before the others arrived. This time, not a car, but a small bird, its wings connected by a clever arrangement of gears scavenged from an alarm clock. He drew the gear ratio calculations along the side margin, using a carpenter's pencil shaved down to its last inch. The pencil lead trembled faintly in his grip, a consequence of malnutrition, or perhaps something deeper, older. By Aero 800, the workshop was filled with the sound of work, the scrape of files, the metallic rasp of hacksaws, the steady whir of a hand-cranked drill. Evans entered with his usual half-smile and a clipboard under his arm. He walked between benches, noting progress, pretending to inspect, but mostly just watching how Vogel worked. "Morning, Lieutenant," Evans said, half-jokingly. "Not Lieutenant. Not anymore," Vogel replied without looking up. His English was getting smoother, learned not from books but from repetition, from necessity. Evans chuckled. "Once a lieutenant, always a lieutenant. At least that's what they say." Vogel smiled faintly. "In Germany they said the same. But now—" He gestured vaguely toward the wire outside. "Now I am only a mechanic." Evans shrugged. "There are worse things to be." He leaned over to inspect the little bird mechanism. The wings were made from tin cut from old ration cans, filed thin enough to flex but strong enough not to tear. The body came from a wooden spool wrapped in copper wire. When Vogel wound the key, the bird twitched, then began to flap its wings, unevenly, awkwardly, but undeniably alive. Evans let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." It wasn't long before word spread. The camp's supervising officer, Captain Leonard McKinney, came to see it for himself. McKinney was a man of Kansas wheat fields, who had joined the Army Engineers because the Depression had left him no choice but to build bridges instead of farms. He recognized precision when he saw it. He picked up the toy bird, tested the spring with a soldier's caution, and smiled something his men hadn't seen him do since VE Day. "You made this from trash?" he asked. "Yes," Vogel said simply. "Everything is trash now." McKinney studied the German's face, the deep lines around his mouth, the intelligent calm in his eyes. He looked less like an enemy and more like a craftsman who'd been misplaced by history. "You could have been making bomb triggers for us to find," McKinney said after a moment. "Instead, you make this." Vogel looked at the toy bird again, its thin wings frozen mid-flutter. "After 6 years, Captain, I prefer things that move forward." McKinney nodded. That single remark was enough. He ordered more scrap metal, old springs, and broken parts to be brought to Building 12. Officially, they were training devices to keep POWs productive. Unofficially, they became a small sanctuary for imagination. Over the weeks that followed, the workshop transformed. Word spread that the German could make almost anything from nothing. A broken typewriter key became the jaw of a tin lion. A discarded sardine tin became a little car. When a guard's daughter turned 8, Vogel built her a dancing doll, its hips made from tiny ball bearings, its arms moved by a hidden camshaft. Something quiet began to change in Camp Butner. Guards who once looked at the prisoners with suspicion now brought them small gifts. Old alarm clocks, bicycle spokes, busted radios. They wanted to see what Vogel would make next. The men in the barracks, hardened soldiers with the ghosts of Stalingrad and Normandy in their memories, began helping him. They scavenged wire and wood, arguing over which toy should come next. In the evenings, when the guards' families gathered near the fence, Vogel would line up the day's creations on a plank. Tiny soldiers, birds, and cars, each moving with its own small rhythm. Laughter filled the gaps between languages, but there was still a shadow behind every sound. For Vogel and the other prisoners, freedom was both close and uncertain. Many were to be repatriated to a Germany now divided and starving. Rumors spread that the Soviets were taking engineers east, that men like Vogel, if sent back, would be made to build for a new war under a different flag. Sometimes, late at night, when the workshop was empty and the air thick with the smell of machine oil, Vogel would sit alone and sketch without purpose. On one page, he drew a toy wind-up soldier, walking forward with its own small clockwork certainty, then stopped. He stared at it for a long time before tearing the page out. The next morning, he began something new, a wind-up train. It would move in circles, endlessly, without a destination, but without destruction. Captain McKinney saw it and said softly, "You ever think about staying here, Vogel?" The German paused, as though the thought had already visited him many times. "I do not know if your country would want me," he said, "but I know I would rather build toys than tanks." McKinney didn't answer right away. He just watched the little train go round, its motion smooth and steady. Maybe, he said finally, America could use a few men who think like that. The words stayed with Vogel long after McKinney left. Outside, the laughter of children drifted across the wire again, the same children who had cheered his first toy car. But this time, when he looked up, he no longer saw the fence as a boundary. He saw it as a line waiting to open. August 1946. The Carolina summer was heavy with heat, the kind that soaked into every wall and made steel tools too hot to touch. The war had been over for more than a year, but for thousands of men behind the fences of Camp Butner, it had not yet ended. Papers moved slower than mercy. Repatriation lists came and went. Names were read aloud in the morning lineups. Names of men who would be shipped home to a country they no longer recognized, or to a border now marked by barbed wire and flags that had replaced other flags. Erich Vogel's name had not been called. He was, officially, awaiting clearance, a bureaucratic limbo reserved for engineers, scientists, and technical specialists, the kind of men the Allied command didn't quite know what to do with. Some would go back to Germany. Others were quietly offered contracts, brought into American or British programs under new identities. Most were simply left to wait. Vogel spent those months in the same place he had spent the last year, Building 12. But the workshop had changed. Its benches now gleamed with careful order. Its shelves were lined with rows of clockwork creations, birds, trains, animals, spinning tops, and tiny mechanical men. Some had been given away to guards' children. Others sat waiting for no one. He had also changed. The gray POW uniform had been replaced with faded work overalls, his hair grown longer, his face leaner, calmer. He carried himself less like a prisoner and more like a craftsman who happened to live within walls of wire. One morning, a black sedan rolled up to the compound gates. Two men in civilian suits stepped out, their jackets too heavy for the southern heat. They spoke briefly with Captain McKinney, who called for Vogel. Inside the command office, one of the men introduced himself in careful German. Mr. Vogel, my name is Robert Lang. I represent an American manufacturing firm based in Ohio, the Weston Toy Company. We've been told about your work. Vogel said nothing at first. His eyes shifted to McKinney, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Lang opened a small box and placed it on the desk. Inside was one of Vogel's toys, the little tin bird. Its wings were slightly bent, but it still moved when Lang turned the key. My daughter received this from one of your guards, Lang said. I thought it was beautiful. Then I heard who made it. He looked at Vogel. Would you show me how it works? Vogel's hands, still thin but steady, took the bird gently. He unscrewed the base, revealing the tiny spring, the lever arm, the escapement gear made from a clock part. His explanation was quiet, simple, methodical. The language barrier melted in the language of mechanism. When he was done, Lang sat back, visibly impressed. You made this from scrap metal and a broken alarm clock? Yes, Vogel said softly. There was nothing else to use. Lang smiled. Then you can make something from nothing. That's what we need in America right now. McKinney exhaled slowly, then said, Mr. Lang's company builds toys, wind-up cars, trains, that sort of thing. They're hiring engineers. They'd like to sponsor you for post-war labor clearance. Vogel blinked, uncertain. You mean I could stay? Legally, yes, Lang replied. It won't be easy. There's paperwork, security reviews, Army oversight. But if Captain McKinney gives his approval, we can make the case. The captain leaned forward. You've earned that chance, Vogel. The world needs builders, not destroyers. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the office clock. Vogel looked down at his calloused hands, still stained with oil, and nodded once. I will build, he said simply. By winter, he was gone from Camp Butner. The men had gathered to see him off, clapping him on the back in a mixture of good wishes and disbelief. Vogel carried only one small suitcase, mostly sketches and notebooks. Before he left, he turned back to the workshop one last time. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air. On the bench, he left behind a toy train, painted with the small American flag one of the guard's children had given him. It was his way of saying thank you. The journey north was a blur, long miles of track through green fields and coal towns, through cities rebuilding themselves with rationed steel and fresh optimism. Ohio, when he arrived, was a place of wide streets, smokestacks, and the smell of industry. At the Weston Toy Company's factory in Dayton, Vogel stepped into a new kind of workshop, larger, noisier, alive with the sound of a different kind of war, the battle for post-war imagination. Here, he was no longer a prisoner or a soldier. He was Erich Vogel, mechanical designer. His desk faced a row of windows that looked out over the assembly floor. Beneath him, young men and women, many of them veterans themselves, assembled toys for a nation rediscovering joy. He worked quietly, methodically, never drawing attention to himself. But his designs, simple, durable, precise, began to define the company's signature style. He created a wind-up locomotive that could run twice as long as any competitor's model, a small tin acrobat that flipped on a bar, and a marching toy soldier that didn't look like a man of war, but like a drummer in a parade. Each carried something of the man who made them: precision, restraint, and the faint echo of loss. When asked where his ideas came from, Vogel would only say, "From the noise of machines that should have built peace sooner." He rarely spoke of Germany. He never mentioned his service, his rank, or what he had built before the war. Only the toys spoke for him now, small miracles of motion, forgiveness rendered in tin and spring steel. And somewhere in Ohio, a generation of American children wound up toys that chirped, rolled, and danced, never knowing that the man who made them had once stood behind wire, dreaming of peace that could fit in a child's hand. Dayton, Ohio, 1951. The factory floor smelled of oil, paint, and warm tin. Rows of machines clattered in a steady rhythm, stamping, cutting, assembling. In one corner, near a drafting table marked with pencil lines and faint circles of spilled coffee, Erich Vogel worked in silence. The war was 6 years behind him now, but for Vogel time had taken on a strange elasticity, not a straight line, but a winding gear that turned backward and forward in slow, patient revolutions. He wore the same work coat every day, dark blue, patched at the elbows, with small stains of graphite and brass dust along the cuffs. Around him hung blueprints pinned to corkboards, toy submarines, walking animals, miniature helicopters. But his newest sketch was different. On the paper lay the outline of a toy he called the Spinner Bird, a simple wooden body with wings that would flap and spin as it rose from a child's hand, carried by a hidden spring. He wasn't designing for the army anymore, or for prisoners beyond the wire. He was designing for laughter and for the quiet miracle that a mechanism, if built just right, could teach joy to replace fear. Every time the prototype failed wings too heavy, spring too weak, Vogel smiled instead of swearing. He would take out his small pocket micrometer, measure again, and adjust. Each failure was familiar, even comforting. Precision was the one language that never betrayed him. Around him, America was changing. The war years had given way to the booming pulse of peace. Cars filled the streets, radios filled kitchens, and in every toy store window, mechanical wonders spun and danced. Rockets, cars, planes, and dolls that walked and blinked. But to Vogel, no matter how modern the designs became, every spring and cam still carried the same heartbeat, a heartbeat he first rediscovered in that dusty workshop at Camp Butner. Sometimes, when the factory closed for the night, he would sit alone under the glow of a desk lamp. From a small wooden box, he'd take out the first toy he'd ever made in captivity, the crude tin car. It still worked, though the paint was flaking and one wheel wobbled. He would wind it up and let it run across the drafting table until it fell silent again. One evening, as he did this, a young American engineer named Tom Weston, the founder's son, walked in. "You still keep that thing?" he asked with a grin. Vogel nodded. "It reminds me that even a broken world can make something that moves." Tom sat across from him. "Dad always says you've got a kind of magic in your hands. He says your gears don't just turn, they mean something." Vogel chuckled softly. "No magic. Just patience." Tom leaned forward. "We've been asked to design a new line. Something different, not just toys that move, but toys that feel alive. Something every child will want to wind again and again. I think you're the man for it. Vogel looked down at his sketches. Alive, he repeated, almost to himself. Yes, I can do that. The project that followed became one of the most beloved toy lines of the decade. Tiny mechanical animals that hopped, spun, or sang, all designed with the same attention to proportion and balance that Vogel had once used to calculate artillery mechanisms. Except now, his measurements led to laughter instead of loss. The spinner bird became the company's bestseller. Its design, a spring-powered rotor with a wing pattern painted in bright red and yellow, allowed it to lift briefly from a child's palm before circling gently to the ground. It was simple, affordable, and full of life. At trade fairs, Vogel stood quietly at the back of the booth, watching as parents and children gathered to watch the toys in motion. He never boasted. He never corrected anyone who assumed he was just another factory foreman. But one afternoon, when a little boy ran up to him, clutching the spinning bird and asking, "Mister, how does it fly?" Vogel knelt down and smiled. "Because," he said, tapping the boy's chest lightly, "someone has to give it a heartbeat first." In later years, his story circulated quietly through the company. The German engineer who had come from a POW camp and built toys that defined an era. He refused publicity, refused interviews. When a journalist from Life magazine tried to feature him in an article about foreign-born innovators, Vogel politely declined. "The toys are enough," he wrote in a short letter. "The children do not need my past." But there were nights when the past visited anyway. Sometimes he would dream of the wire fences and the faces beyond them, the children laughing, the guards watching, the faint hum of the lathe in the background. He would wake before dawn, open the window of his small apartment, and let the cool air in. America, he thought, sounded like the click of a spring before release, tense with possibility. By the time the 1950s drew to a close, the Weston Toy Company had expanded threefold. Their toys sat under Christmas trees across the country, and among them always was the spinner bird, stamped in small letters on the underside, "Designed by E. Vogel." Most people never wondered who that was, but for those who knew him, for Captain McKinney, who still wrote him letters every Christmas, and for the children who grew up winding his toys, the name carried something rare, the proof that a man could take the machinery of war and reassemble it into joy. On a quiet December evening in 1958, Erich Vogel closed the factory for the night. Snow fell outside, silent and patient. He placed his tools in order, caliper, ruler, pencil, then wound the little tin car one last time. It rolled across the table, bumping softly against a stack of blueprints. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. The car had never rolled perfectly straight, but perhaps that was the point. Nothing born from war ever did, and yet it moved forward, always forward.